bringing you information and analysis. My name is Dumile Matez. Remember, you can also be part of our discussion today by calling our studio line on 011 714 5497 or 5498, or tweet us at Rights Recourse. Alternatively, email your thoughts to rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. Do you realize what a powerful force is gathered here tonight between these four walls? Show me a greater power on the whole continent of Africa. Show me a greater power anywhere. These words were those of Henning Klopper, the first chairman of the Afrikaner Broederbond, in a celebratory speech on the occasion of the organization's 50th anniversary in 1968. As seen by the Broeders, whatever the outsider's view of the Broederbond, those on the inside see it as a noble organization. They claim credit for dramatically improving the Afrikaner's economic position and the putting him in political control. The exclusivity, the strict secrecy are explained away as necessary to the salvation of the Afrikanerdom. And indeed, of all the people in South Africa, today on Rights and Recourse, on this Heritage Day, we'll be exploring the legacy and history of the Afrikaner Broederbond. To discuss today's topic, we are joined in the studio by Mr. Jan Bosman, Chief Secretary of the Afrikaner Bond, Professor Louis Du Plessis, member of the editorial board, explanatory political dictionary, whatever that may be, and lastly, Dr. Piet Kroukamp, political analyst from the University of the Northwest. Gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Good afternoon. Thank you, sir.
Probably, Professor Du Plessis, let's start with this question. The most important question to ask is, what drove the Afrikaner to come to the establishment of the Afrikaner Broederbond on June the 5th, 1918, at number 10 Marathon Street in Malvern?
Mr. Mateza, it is a fantastic question because I would like to answer that. 100 years ago, there was no Afrikaner Broederbond whatsoever. A year later, it was established. So what was the trigger for this? In 1918, the Northern Afrikaners from Johannesburg invited the editor of Die Burger in the Cape, Dr. D.F. Malan, to come and talk to them, to promote Afrikaans culture, Afrikaans language, and also
Is this the meeting you're talking about? Gentlemen, if you want to come in, you can come in any time. Let's have a discussion. Is this the meeting you're talking about that was held at Selborne Hall at the Johannesburg City Hall, where some people removed the Union Jack, and then the English came and they put up the Union Jack?
The English couldn't come in. The Union Jack was folded up and put there, but they couldn't. They wanted to break in, and a huge mass of English-speaking, young, white English-speaking people tried to break up the meeting, which they couldn't do. So they went to an Afrikaner club in Lovedale Street and they broke it up. And they took the furniture out and they burned the furniture on the pavement the Saturday, the 13th of April, 1918. And they came back the next night, the Sunday night, to do it again, but they were then blocked by the police. So the Afrikaners felt threatened in a certain sense, and they started to hold meetings to maintain the fact and their right that they have got the right to have meetings and freedom of association. And from then onwards, for the next year, they had meetings starting in Boksburg, Brakpan, Johannesburg, and everywhere. And at the end of the year, they realized we have now established an organization for rights of Afrikaners to have the freedom of movement and the freedom of association. And they called it, they backdated it because they thought, when were we strong? They thought 6th of June is a nice date. So they decided the 6th of June 1918 was the establishment of our movement to maintain the rights of Afrikaners against being suppressed by Northern Englishmen.
To what extent did the Anglo-Boer War contribute to this formation of the Afrikaner Broederbond?
Yeah, I think there are several events that contribute to, I think, the DNA of Afrikaner politics, the two world wars, of course, as well, but certainly the Boer Wars had a significant impact in how the Afrikaners defined themselves, how they saw themselves, and also how they identify their enemies. And of course, you're always vulnerable unless you sort of institutionalize your perceived identity or your envisaged identity. And the Afrikaner Bond and the Broederbond at the time was a form of institutionalization of the Afrikaner identity. You have to root it somewhere in the political system. And then over time, of course, you have to spread it. You have to develop it. You have to permeate all sorts of other sectors of society, the economy, the political system, socially, cultural, the religious system, etc. So I think, yes, it is true that I think much of, even today, if you look at the way that conservative Afrikaners mobilize themselves, that idea of victimhood, that idea of being persecuted in the past is still very much part of the definition of how it has evolved. Yeah.
Well, you're right. We remember the meetings that were held about 2 years ago, led by AfriForum and Solidarity at the Voortrek Agreement.
Yeah, no, it's a similar thing. I think if you try to draw a line from 1918 and even before that, since the Boer War, I think you will see that you'll find the traces of the DNA of how the Afrikaners eventually perceive themselves, and also how they perceive those who either considered to be the enemy or the opposition, or how to establish themselves to ensure their longevity.
Jan, you as the let me come home, you as the CEO of the Afrikaner Bond, when somebody asks you, what is the Afrikaner Bond, where does it come from, how do you answer them?
I think it's important to take the context of the time frame in which the Afrikaner Broederbond was established in 1918. You referred to it now, and I think Professor Du Plessis and also Dr. Krokamp also gave some context. But what is important is that starting in 1880, you had extreme poverty amongst Afrikaners, living in the farms, having large families, no education whatsoever. And then the Second Boer War came, and many Afrikaners fled from farms, were extremely in extreme poverty, and came to cities. And in that context, in 1918, the 5 members of the Afrikaner Broederbond at that stage, amongst them members from the educational profession, amongst them ministers of religion, amongst them people who worked on the railways and so on, came together and said, we need to do something about the educational upliftment of the Afrikaner, and we also need to do something about the economic upliftment of the Afrikaner. And that was the 2 main goals at that stage in 1918. And throughout the history, in the first couple of years in the establishment of the Afrikaner Broederbond, you had a very big focus on education, and then after that on the economy, when the Afrikaner had certain projects and programs way before 1948 to start with economic upliftment.
We'll come to the economic upliftment. Professor Du Plessis, it has always been referred to as a cultural organization, and critics believe, and judging by its role and how it influenced the politics of South Africa, that it was more than a cultural organization, but the power behind the National Party government.
Good. Can I answer that? To answer that, I'll just briefly refer to what I would define as the phases of the Afrikaner Bond. Phase 1 was a very strong phase of establishment of Afrikaans cultural organizations. I mentioned 1 or 2. In 1929, the FAK was established by the Afrikaner Broederbond, by 400 Afrikaners who convened in Bloemfontein. In 1930 in Cape Town, the ATKV, where by the Afrikaner Bond, but where Afrikaner Bond people played a role. The Sanlam was created in the 1930s. OPSA, then called the Volksbank or Volkskas, in 1937, created directly by a bloke called Bosman, not this Bosman, a very senior Bosman.
There's been lots of Bosmans in the AB.
Office of the Afrikaner Bond. He was the treasurer of the Afrikaner Bond, created EPSA. And Naspers was then very strong in the Cape, but in the north there was some problems, and the Transvaler was created in Johannesburg, and the Afrikaans Radio in 1938, and so forth and so on. And what Jan said is very important: poverty. The Afrikaner Bond behaved in a certain sense like the EFF. They emphasized poor people and to develop poor people, to support poor people. That is Nationale Volkscongress, the National Economic Conference. This whole thing, what we discuss now, since 1918 to 1948, I would like to call the first phase. Can I say something about the second phase?
No, let's wait for the second. We'll come to the second phase. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Krokamp. Despite the peace treaty with the English, there was a huge number of Afrikaners calling themselves Wittereinders, who were still bitter with the English about the concentration camps, the way they were treated, the way their language was treated.
The Afrikaners at the time was very much like the Afrikaners today. There was always a group that felt whatever compromise. Look, Afrikaners throughout history had, they had the tendency to go into compromises for their own political survival. You've seen it from the earliest times. They tend to initially draw a hard line, and then eventually they're willing to compromise. But there's always a splinter group of them who don't want to compromise. And throughout history, you can see all the big political events where the Afrikaners were involved. Always there's a group that compromised and there's a group that refused to compromise. But I think, just to briefly refer to your question earlier, it's obvious that the Broederbond never was a cultural organization. It was a state-capturing organization. It is, in fact...
I like that term.
It has captured the financial systems. It has captured the parastatals. It has captured cultural organizations. It has captured the media was captured by everything was captured by the Broederbond over time. Not necessarily the Broederbond only, but the National Party and the Broederbond. But
including the SABC.
Yes, including the SABC. There was not a single institution that was left untouched. And if you draw the parallels between what has happened in black resistance and in Afrikaner resistance, you know, they lived in poverty, they were pushed off their land, the Afrikaners mostly by urbanization. They moved to cities, they became alienated, they needed economic power, they needed to capture institutions to get that economic power because it didn't come easily. They didn't have the education. It took them a long time. They set up educational systems. So they really created the infrastructure. And I must, for all their faults, I must admit that the National Party and the Broederbond, they really distributed wealth to a large degree. Afrikaners became well educated. They built up assets. They became important and influential in many institutions. With a lot of assistance, unfair assistance, and to the exclusion of most other people. That's true. But that concentration, that monopolization of resources at the top, that didn't really exist. They really distributed, and there was a general empowerment from the grassroots. But at the exclusion of black South Africans and English South Africans. I think we talked, just the last point, we talked earlier about, I think I heard this, saw the statistic somewhere that when the National Party took over 64%, I think, of the police force were English speaking. And I think 5 years later, it was rare to find a Saiti in the police. You know, they just captured the institution and took it over.
Jan, I saw you shaking your head when Dr. Krokamp was talking about state capture.
Yeah, once again, you need to put it in context, and I think the reference to state capture today is totally different to what state capture meant at that stage. And I think what was important was the empowerment of the Afrikaner, and at that stage, you remember that it was an overwhelmingly English society that we lived in, also in the civil service. And when the National Party came into power in 1948, and that was I think that was the third leg of the Broederbond's involvement. After the educational upliftment, the economic upliftment, came the political upliftment. And
but Jan, I don't want to interrupt you, but talking about state capture and the fact that it was no state capture, that was real state capture. If you read Hans Strydom and Ivor Wilkins's Super Afrikaners, they say in the John Vorster cabinet, for instance, there were only 2 ministers who were not members of the Afrikaner Broederbond. Owen Hout, who was Minister of Finance, and Marais Steyn was Minister of Tourism, simply because Owen Hout was English, Marais Steyn came from the United Party.
Once again, I want to take you back to the context in which the Broederbond was formed, and that you need to recognize the fact that the Broederbond said that we make from leaders in society, we will make them members of our society. So you need to be a leader to become a member. We identified leaders in society and we made them members. And those leaders are people in their own right who were people who were professional, who with merit progressed through the ranks in civil service, in the economy, wherever they were involved. And I think it's there's a lot of perceptions about the Broederbond, and you needed to be a member to become or to have some progression in life and so on, and that's simply not true. And I invite anyone out there to prove me the opposite. I think there's many instances where there may have been an example of someone who said he was not promoted to a position, and it's because of the Broederbond. Let's look at that individual, but it was never.
We'll come back to that as we go along. If you'd like to join us in today's discussion, you can call us on 011 714 5497 or 5498, or tweet us at Rights Recourse. Alternatively, email your thoughts to rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. Stay with us.
with the stories of abuse from the other 8, but they haven't been ready to pursue any angles. They've offered their support, they've offered the comfort to the 8, and it's been an amazing journey.
It feels like your heart actually literally sunk in your shoes.
It wasn't a long encounter. I think at the time I froze.
The way the criminal justice system deals with sexual violence is problematic. And I don't know, unless there's a fundamental change in many things, the way prosecutors deal with the victim in the matter.
For all investigative insights, stay tuned to Special Assignment every Saturday at 17:30.
Welcome back to Rights and Recourse as we discuss the legacy and the history or the heritage of the Afrikaner Broederbond in South Africa. Professor du Plessis, one of the biggest things I was trying to get around my head was the relationship between the Afrikaner Broederbond and the Ossebrandwag, to which Lang Hendrik belonged and John Foster belonged.
Yeah. Okay, very interesting question. It is also related to what the two gentlemen said before. We must get our cause and effect correct. What we have got here in the first half of the 20th century is a huge movement of Afrikaner nationalism. The Afrikaner Bond is but one vehicle, one institution. I mentioned a few, I can mention more than a few hundred of them. Movements promoting the rights of Afrikaners, and especially the language of Afrikaners. And the National Party was very important in politics. And the Afrikaner Bond, in terms of culture and playing other important role. The Ossebrandwag was a militant organization. Just before and
they were opposed to the war, to South Africa taking part in the war, in the First World War.
Yeah, the Second World War.
The Second
World War. Yeah. At the beginning of.
Did they support the Nazis, or were they just opposed to the war, or were they generally on Germany's side at the time?
No,
that was the question. To what extent did they find, a political affinity for the German?
I don't even want to associate. Yeah, I don't even want to associate myself too much with the question, because then we take the attention away from the Afrikaner Bond. It was just one of the sort of militant movements, and the National Party, especially after 1941, became very strong, pro-democratic and anti-Ossebrandwag, and the Broederbond with it, or the Afrikaner Broederbond, because the Afrikaners are very democratic in this sense, and they knew they could win in the election, which they in fact did in 1948.
The other question for me, Jan, doing research on this for this program, I just could not understand why General Barry Hertzog was opposed to the Afrikaner Broederbond in the way he was, and this was demonstrated in the Smithfield address he made, where he criticized the Broeders, and after that he went into oblivion and he went to stay on his own until his son Albert came up.
I think I said that before the program, that I think Hertzog and maybe some of the policies at that stage created the environment in which the Afrikaner Broederbond then said, but we need to work in confidentiality, and they sort of forced members of the Afrikaner Bond, because there was a desperate or a call for people in civil service to either be a member of the Afrikaner Broederbond or be a civil servant. You couldn't be both. So there was a definite focus on members of the Afrikaner Broederbond at that stage who were members of civil service and also other institutions to say that you need to choose between your membership or the... So there was a real call, and I think it was in opposition to some of the policies at that stage within the environment in which the Afrikaner Broederbond functioned, to say that you need to focus. You can either be a civil servant but you cannot be both. And that created the tension and created the environment in which the Broederbond became a confidential organization.
Dr. Kruikamp, Jan said Mr. Bosman said we must convince him that the project Afrikaner Broederbond was actually state capture. At the 50th anniversary of the Afrikaner Broederbond in 1968, the founding chairman of the bond, Herman Klopper, who later became Speaker of Parliament, is quoted to have said, and I quote, "We are part of the state, we are part of the church, we are part of every big movement that has been born of the nation, and we make our contributions unseen. We carried them through to the point that our nation has reached today. Was this not some form of state capture?
Yeah, I think it was a complete form of state capture. I think something that will offend Jan is the notion that state capture, as we know it, is associated with corruption. And he would like to argue that it might have been a political project to occupy the state, to occupy cultural institutions and the church and the civil service and the state organized, parastatals. So it was a political project, and it's an empowerment project, and it had noble ideas, and it wasn't corrupt. But that doesn't take away from the fact that first and foremost, the Afrikaner said to himself, I have to capture the state. If I want to have economic freedom, I must get political freedom first. And they captured the state, and then they deliberately, by positioning individuals at the right places and penetrating financial institutions and economic institutions, they deliberately, from over time, they captured beyond the state. And they captured the economic institutions as well. So I think it's a very, very successful project of state capturing, and I would call it a politically corrupt process of state capturing, but I wouldn't say it's economically corrupt. It did empower the poorest, the poor Afrikaners. There was almost no unemployment amongst Afrikaners. They got the best medical service you can imagine. There was nothing that wasn't absolutely perfectly fitted to uplift the Afrikaner from poverty and from victimhood. The political judgment, of course, will be harsh. The economic judgment is that if it wasn't for that, I will always wonder where would Afrikaners today have been if it wasn't for the National Party and the Broederbond.
Professor, one of the things that I came across, even if the Broeders would want us to believe, however, that it's more than state capture, because members of parliament, for instance, let me give you an example, ministers, prime ministers and presidents were members of this secret organization. First of all, why secret? Why did they become a secret organization? For instance, Hendrik Verwoerd was member number 1596. His successor, John Foster, was member number 3737. P.W. Botha, after him, was member number 4487. Why the secrecy? And why do we say it was not state capture when all of these prime ministers were actually members of the Broederbond?
Mr. Mateza, it's all very interesting questions and also with very complicated answers. Dr. D.F. Malan was a member. Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd was a member. You know, the Afrikaners like poetry. Their top poets, Dirk Opperman was a member. NP van Wyk Lou was a member.
Was NP a member?
He was a member.
With all of his liberal, I've read his stuff, liberale nationalism.
Absolutely. I can go on and on and on. It is not, and I want to emphasize this, it's not as if they were only members of the Afrikanerbond, they were also members of the FAK, and they banked at Volkskas, they were members of Sanlam. It was a national movement. And they were all, of course, supporters of the National Party. So it was not as if you can just relate them to the Afrikaner Broederbond.
So it was state capture?
Yeah, but there's one part of your question I didn't answer. It's a question of
secrecy.
Okay. I'm not defending anything. I just also try to understand it. And I explained that in my very first answer that the people they thought they had to move in a certain way behind the scenes, because when they hold meetings, the meetings are broken up. So for a certain period of time, the Afrikanerbond thought they can only be successful if they maintain a level of secrecy. I do not say it's correct or incorrect, but in fact, all the other organizations were in the open.
But I don't think it's that simple. I think it's different. If you, the moment you take merit out of a cause, and I think we have some evidence of even today, the moment you take merit out of a cause, and you have to find subjective justification for the promotion of an individual for the purposes of occupying an institution and getting the authority over that institution, if you take merit out of it, it makes sense to make it a secret institution. So how can I promote somebody to a position which gives me political control over that institution? By pretending that he's not a member of a particular philosophy. So what you do is you take away the philosophy, you strip him of the philosophy by giving him a number, you put him in a position, he becomes authoritative, and now he can advance the interest that you perceive to be in the interest of the Afrikaners, for instance. So it's very simple. It's not possible to have an institution like the Afrikaner Bond if it's not secret, because otherwise merit must count, and the Afrikaner Bond was deliberately undermining the principle of merit. If you're black, you're not allowed to own land. It's not because you're not a good farmer, because you're black, you're not allowed to own land. If you're English, you're not allowed to be a policeman, because we can't trust the policeman, an English policeman. So the moment you take merit out of the equation, then it makes sense to be secret. And the Broederbond relied heavily on the principle of Afrikaner promotion as opposed to the principle of promotion on the principle of merit.
Let's take this call from Lagos in Nigeria. Andres, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Good day.
Good day.
My name is Ainsley. I'm phoning from Lagos in Nigeria. I'm a South African.
Yes.
And I'd just like to say, you know, I've lived through quite a number of eras. When I started to go to school, we were still a union. We then became a republic, and now we're obviously in the new South Africa. And I'd just like to say that, you know, I, as an English-speaking South African with mixed ancestry, looked very much and was always from a young age interested in politics, etc. And what I found is the Broederbond was an organization created to uplift the Afrikaner people. And I must congratulate the Broederbond. As much as I was an English-speaking person, they did it. They didn't only do it for the rich and the top echelon of Afrikaners, but they did it for the poor people. They created out of a nation which was suppressed by the British and were almost lived in mud huts, you could almost say, up to a nation to be very proud of, with international people representing the country all over the world on forums, etc. So very much mission accomplished. As opposed to what we have now, we have a situation where the people are not benefiting out of the system. So what I'm saying is, you know, if we could have a system where, you know, true Bantu comes in and really they care about the people, and I think the EFF is unfortunately the biggest challenge to the ANC is not from anybody, the DA or anybody, but from the EFF, because sooner or later the people are going to say, but what about us? I remember as a child, you know, at the post office going there and trying to get stamps and things like that, and my mother used to come back and say, geez, the woman can't even add 1 and 1. But this is what the Afrikaners did. They chucked people into positions who didn't have the capacity to do that, but to uplift them. And we've gone through that in South Africa, but you know what? The problem is the funds, and I'll say it again, the funds, because I believe there was things. I mean, Hendrik Kruilen Wenzel bought my water tank, and it really made me very cross, because I paid for the water tank, but they were highly apologetic, but they did say, you know, it's the minister, so we had to give him your water tank.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you very much, Andre. Andre, I want to take the last part of Andre's question or comment. There is, however, one thing the Afrikaners did exceptionally well, as Andre also attests, and that is, I dare say, they did this ruthlessly. And as soon as the National Party won in 1948, without any apologies, it was the empowerment of the Afrikaners. Though, first, their affirmative action policy. 2, they removed Major General Everett Poole as head of the Defence Force 43 days after the National Party victory in 1948. They removed Marshal Clark and replaced him with DRC du Plessis. They removed Gideon Roos at the SABC. He must have said something unsavory during a celebration of the Groot Trek from Cape Town to Johannesburg, to Gauteng, although an Afrikaner himself. And this is what Andre was referring to.
Can I just take a step back, and I want to refer to the economic upliftment first, and I think that's part of the discussion today, because we are with Heritage Day, and we need to also discuss the heritage of the Afrikaner on Heritage Day. No need to ignore our history. We need to take the lessons from the past. What happened, and that's where I agree with the caller beforehand, was that Afrikaners amongst themselves, and that was even before the National Party came into power in 1948, they started the Reddingsdaad-Bond and Federale Volksbelegging as an investment arm. They created a savings fund in which 70,000 families monthly contributed 6 pence every month. I had an actuary calculation done about 2 weeks ago to ask what was the value of 6 pence in today's money. It's about 17.50 rand in today's money. But through that, a fund of £2 million were established, through which companies were funded. Loans.
And this is how Volkskas was started.
That was amongst one of the things that happened. Volkskas was started. Other companies now know. Dr. Anton Rupert also received a loan from those funds. £2 million in that stage, today's value is about 550 million rand. So there's the will, if Afrikaners want to do it amongst themselves. Why can't we repeat history again today to have an economic upliftment? Why do we need to wait for the state to have this process where money are getting lost on a huge and a scale that we cannot
my apology, Doctor. I still want this question answered, the one that I raised earlier around the removal of English-speaking people from positions, and Afrikaners were put in those positions. But let's take this call from Peter first. He's not there. Okay, Dr. Krokamp, you were saying something.
Yeah, I think the real question is, of course, and I agree there's a romantic picture to be painted about Afrikaner upliftment, but at what cost for other South Africans did it come? I think that's the real question. And if I say, if the Afrikaner Bond, for instance, or conservative Afrikaners today will say, okay, we admit in this grand project that we designed, this narrative about our history that we designed, somebody else paid part of this bill. If you are prepared to admit it, then the picture of the Afrikaner Bond and the picture of Afrikaner politics becomes more nuanced and perhaps more palatable, you know. But I think there's denial that the good that has happened to the Afrikaners, somebody paid for it, and unfortunately black South Africans paid a tremendous price for it. English-speaking people paid a certain degree of price for it, even though I think the English turned this whole thing around over the 40 years of Afrikaner rule, and they actually, once they were removed from the state, became entrepreneurs, and for a large part of their history, they dominated the South African economy in spite of Afrikaner intentions to also get part of the economic spoils. But they did really, really well once they were pushed out of the state. And exactly the same thing happened now. When the Afrikaners in 1994 were told, listen, pack your bags, guys, sunset clause, but you won't be here for much longer, they became extremely entrepreneurial and really, really wealthy. They're doing the best of any population in the post-democratic South Africa. So what I'm trying to say is, but those years, certainly black South Africans were robbed of the opportunity to design a form of demographic dividend for themselves, which will allow them today to be better educated, better health services, and perhaps just a black middle class. The black middle class was virtually destroyed as a possibility by the rise of the Afrikaners and the extent to which the English occupy the economy.
Professor, you touched on it earlier, the fact that the Afrikaner at the time, they started this communication network, I mean newspapers, the Vaderland, I don't know whether the Vaderland was, but the Transvaaler and the Burger in the Cape, of which Dr. D.F. Malan was the editor. Yeah. And also now you have this huge empire of Naspers, multi-choice, who were favoured with during the National Party, were favoured with a broadcasting license.
Absolutely, wonderful. I just want to make some correction about what the previous speaker said here. The following is the basic...
Professor, just hold your thought. Just hold it. Let's take this call from Boy from Gauteng. Boy, good afternoon, and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon to me and the crew there.
Yes.
Okay, actually I'm interested in the topic of the African Broederbond and the gentleman there. The time National Party took over, are you with me?
Yes, we are with you, boss.
Yes. Their idea to keep up their custom and tradition was fine, but only what I do appreciate what they are doing. And then what I didn't like the time of the National Party was to just separate development, putting the blacks aside. If it was then made, as the case in Orania, where they got that culture of them there, I appreciate that. What about, I just want to know what other things that they can steal to the present dispensation health situation. The people to have their own separate tradition and tradition at their own places, with one central government, maybe Pretoria, but to maintain their status of their culture. That was my idea. I just want to know if they can answer that.
Thank you very much, Boyce. I think Boyce is making reference. I think the professor is well suited to answer that question, because it drives to the fact that the Afrikaners have a lot of cultural organizations that are still intact and are doing very good work, some of them. Probably you can answer my other questions, where they build this huge empire of communications in terms of newspapers, television, radio, as you said earlier, and also the fact that they now run multi-choice NASPers and all that is dominating South Africa.
I'll start with the first part of the question, which was very interesting. And of course, all the statements made that the Afrikaners governed and they promoted Afrikaners to a large degree is very interesting. And you can make good arguments out for that. It took the Afrikaner movement, not the Afrikaner Broederbond and not the National Party, all the Afrikaners think tanks like Sabra and others, 20 years.
Sabra was created by the Afrikaner
Bond,
of which MC Botha was the chairman.
A dedicated think tank, the South African Bureau for Racial Affairs. It took them 20 to 30 years for the Afrikaners and the white people just to understand they can incorporate within the central political system votes for colored people, votes for Indian people. And it took them another time to accept there must be, for South Africa to work, a one-man, one-vote system. In fact, the Afrikaner Bond in 1986 wrote a thick, very complicated and fantastic document called The Basic Political Requirements for the Future, debating this with the National Party and with the other Afrikaans organizations. And what is so interesting, when they decided at last that there should be a system incorporating everybody because of the tremendous development of the education system for black people under the National Party government, and for the urbanization of blacks as a consequence of National Party policies.
My apologies, Professor, to interrupt you. That education policy in 1954 was criticized, and many black academics left South Africa running away from what would have been a watered down. I remember clearly, I was reading The White Tribe of Africa, and there's a quote in that book that says, Verwoerd said, what is the use of teaching a Bantu mathematics?
Okay,
is that what you're talking about?
I'm talking exactly about this. That is one quote of hundreds of other quotes by Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd, who in his time developed Bantu education unbelievably. I mean, when he left as leader, there was more than 2 million new entrants into the so-called Bantu education system. Of course, it was disciplined education and another kind of education, but the point is this: the unforeseen consequence of this, that at the end, the level of education of all the peoples in South Africa, I refer specifically to the Bantu people, was so high that at the end the National Party and the Afrikaner Bond and everybody had to say, well, South Africa cannot work if we haven't got another political system. And I want to quote something here. When this document was distributed by the Afrikaner Bond to Cabinet and to all this, then it was about 800 divisions, meaning think tanks, branches of the Afrikaner Bond, countrywide in the 1980s. When it was distributed, there were many questions asked in the Afrikaner Broederbond divisions, and they said, well, and I want to quote one specific person who was very eloquent, Piet Celier, Erdhof the Burger. He was a member, of course, of the Broederbond. He said for 20 years, 30 years, 80 years, we have taught people, if they share power like this, they will commit suicide. Use the Afrikaans word. Hulle sal political selfmoord pleeg. But, said he, we can't do anything else. We must make it work. And that was decided in the deepest interior of the Afrikaner Broederbond.
We'll take one more break, and I want to go back and pursue this issue with Dr. Kurokamp, this issue of Bantu education being very good education. I went through that education myself, but if you'd like to join us in today's discussion, you can call us on 011-714-5497, 5498, or tweet us at Recourse, or alternatively you can email our thoughts to rights@sabc.co.za. Stay with us.
happens when we put our differences aside and we come together as a human race.
Salt makes its way out of the kitchen into the art studio.
Normally, you know, salt is for food and stuff, but then here's salt.
Past couple of months I've grown so much and I'm just ready to impart what I've learned to the next Miss South Africa.
I wasn't expecting this. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity. I'm feeling so overwhelmed.
For your weekly dose of entertainment news, tune into Trends every Saturday from 12 to 1.
Welcome back to Rise and Recourse. We've been going on so fast. We haven't been able to keep time. Let's go to Ornella from Johannesburg. Ornella, good afternoon and welcome to Rise and Recourse.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mateza and your guest.
Good afternoon, sir.
Yes, I think I would like to agree with Dr. Krookamp about the Broederbond capturing the state. But the difference comparing it to now is that the Broederbond was doing its missions to help the Afrikaners out of poverty. It didn't focus only, as we compare it to now, it's only the Zuma family and the Guptas and so on. It's not only a minority, it was for the large Afrikaner population. But all of that they were doing, it was at the expense of blacks because they were using cheap labor of blacks and so on. But the irony is that now, the same position that the Afrikaners were against, us as blacks, we are in that same position that every sector is dominated by Afrikaners. We are nearly at the bottom, we are only saving them. And the ANC as the government now, it can't really take out blacks because it doesn't have control of most other sectors of government. Thank you.
Thank you, Ornella. Jan, you wanted to refer to something Boyce was talking about, separate development. And I want you to also include in that separate development the fact that this was a policy that was actually crafted by the Afrikanerbond and handed over to H.F. Verwoerd.
I think it was a policy that had its ideas within an ideal that wanted to be achieved within separate development from that the policy or the word apartheid flowed. And Peter's right. In the promotion of Afrikaners, I think the focus was only on Afrikaners and to the detriment of other populations in South Africa. That is correct. And to say today that we need to now level the playing fields and we need to, vilify Afrikaners because of that, if that's your perception, then so be it. What I want to take from the past is to say that we never need to repeat the history again in South Africa, but we are repeating history again. We are now excluding people again, and we are now sort of having a new form of apartheid in South Africa that we cannot afford in this country. I think it's at a very late stage. The previous caller, and may I also answer his question, also referred to state capture. If your definition of state capture, and that's my opinion. If the definition of state capture by the Broederbond was that you have an efficient service, that you have a professional service, that you have a functioning service, that you have a service where corruption was where very few cases of corruption happened, and where there was corruption, prosecution followed.
Somebody was telling me apartheid itself was corruption.
Apartheid itself?
Yes.
Well, that's you said political corruption. I disagree. So if that's your definition of state capture, then I think if you have a professional service, then so be it. Then we had a professional service up to 1994. But what happened after that, I think that is the matter that needs to be addressed today.
But then I guess I think you made reference to Bantu education, and I'm always extremely sensitive when we start to romanticize about the real worth of Bantu education. We can argue about how much was spent on black education if you want, and you will see that there's a problem. We can argue about teachers allocated to black children and the philosophy that they don't need mathematics teacher because they will be workers and laborers beyond their tertiary education or their secondary education. That's the one thing. But the much more damaging feature of the Afrikaner project was the breakup of black citizens' family lives. That goes to the heart of black education. The parents were banished to the homelands. There's nothing romantic about the homeland system. This whole idea that there's something romantic about the separate development, that it is some idea rooted in a beautiful idea, that but it just had bad consequences, is absolute nonsense. And every clerk liked to sell that. The fact is, the homeland system destroyed black families. Those children coming from broken families where the husband worked in a mine somewhere, and later on when we liberalized the system, the mother was allowed to go and work in a house somewhere, and the children stayed with the grandparents and with other family members. Even to this day, 62% of all children in South Africa live in a house where there's only one adult, and 50% of those cases that adult is not the biological parent. So we destroyed the fabric of the black family in the first place. Now we send those children to school, and then the philosophy of black education was, remember, we give you an education, but it's a paternalistic education, and you are inferior politically. No doubt about it that black children were taught in school that they are inferior. They were taught in a foreign language, in English and in Afrikaans. They were forced to teach to study in Afrikaans. So just remember, the philosophy behind black education and Bantu education was where the real damage was. The destruction of the black family, that's where the real damage was of Bantu education. This paternalistic intention from, I provide education to you, I build a school for you, I even build you university in the homeland. That form of paternalism is romanticizing something which had an utterly destructive root. And I think that's, sometimes if we deny that, it's as if we look at the surface. Look, we built you a school. What is the philosophy? When a black child sits in school, when you're a white child, they teach you your self-worth is important. That's what's going to get you somewhere. A black child was taught right from the beginning, your self-worth is limited by the fact that you are marginalized politically, that you don't deserve to be on the same level as a white child. And there's no doubt about it that was a type of cultural chauvinism which even to this day is something that Afrikaans just can't escape from. We can't escape our history because of that chauvinism, and that was the root of Bantu education.
Professor, I just want us to talk about the church. Yeah. There was a saying that the influential NG Kerk at the time was the National Party in prayer. Yeah. And it would seem that it also came under very strong influence on the Afrikaanse Broederbond. And how could it not have been because the Broederbond had two dominees in Joshua Nodier, who was the father of Beyers Nodier, and William Nicol. Reverend William Nicol, yes, the very William Nicol, who has two streets named after him in Johannesburg, the William Nicol Drive and another William Nicol in the West Rand. Who was based in is this assertion right that the National Party actually listened to the church and listened to the Broederbond?
The National Party, the Broederbond, and all the other Afrikaans organizations played a very important role, I say again, in conjunction with one another. And in the thinking patterns within the different meetings of the NG Church and their Hervormde Church and all the other churches, they very deeply thought about what is going on in South Africa, how the emphasis should fall on development, how it should fall on the message of Scripture. And some of the most brilliant people came out of the NG Church who said we must change the system and make it more human, like Beyers Nodier, which was a member of the Afrikaner Bond.
But Professor, how was he treated? He was defrocked with Professor Albert Geyser, because they said apartheid cannot be justified biblically.
It was a process which we have to understand, and unfortunately Piet he doesn't analyze what is going on, he condemns it. He doesn't try to understand. He just condemns whatever is in front of him. You can use negative words and destroy things, or you can say no, like the historian Leopold von Ranke said, try to understand the facts, how the process is developed. I'm not defending anything or attacking anything. We've got a process of how development spreads all over Africa, all through South Africa. In this, the Afrikaners played a role. But can I just answer a question that is sort of subliminal, that people don't explicitly answer or ask, but which we should answer? It is this question. Why must the Afrikaners then do it only for Afrikaners, or have done it for Afrikaners? Why not for everybody? This is a fundamental, subliminal, assumed question. I'll tell you what, go and ask that to the Croatian people living in Serbia. Organize for their own boards. Go and ask it for the Swedish people who live in Estonia to organize self-determination and influence for them. Go and, the Jews here in Rosebank, go and ask them. The Jews have got their own medical service.
We'll go there. We'll touch on those.
I just want people to organize themselves.
I just want, for the time we have, for Jan to just tell us what is happening with the Afrikaner Broederbond now.
I think we're still on the level of being or trying to be a think tank, to try and influence people, to have this constitution in a practical form for Afrikaners as well, to take from this constitution what we think we can utilize today, to say something like education in mother tongue, for instance, Afrikaans in education, to promote that, to try and resolve the issues, to have interaction with government. I cannot claim any success today. But what we say is we are trying to use this constitution also for Afrikaners in South Africa.
Well, I had a lot of questions around the church and also around empowerment, especially the minds that were the formation of JANCO, which became an Afrikaans organization, but we'll do that at another time. I think if I want to talk about the church, I'll have to invite the NG Kerk here. And what I wanted to, let's talk about Dr. Krokamp, about the formation of JANCO. Apparently the formation of JANCO was formed by minds that were given to the Afrikaners by Anglo-American.
Yeah, the argument will always be whether they're given and what was the what was the deal really. But I think it is true that, and you will see later years that the Anglo-American was dominant role player in the mining industry, but I think Afrikaners on a management level started to become important in all sectors of the economy and certainly also in the mining sector. But I think that's part of the philosophy, was to penetrate all spheres of society. And I think the question that always has to be asked, at whose expense it was. And let's face it, that control of the mining industry was at the expense of the workers. Control of the church was at the expense of black people, black Christians. Control of all institutions was always at the expense of somebody. And it wasn't that the philosophy couldn't have been, we will do it for you too. The philosophy should have been, allow yourself to do it for yourselves. And I think that's where the big problem, the difference between us perhaps is. I can't accept this paternalistic view of, we as Afrikaners could have done it for you too. No. Allow people to do it for themselves.
Gentlemen, I'm sorry, we have quickly run out of time. T. Dunbar Moody, writing in a paper on NP van Wyk Law and the morality of the predicament of Afrikaner nationalism, said, I quote, "Suppose that a people has come into narrows, finding that it must mount a life of death and defense. It summons up all material and political powers, guards and marshals, its spiritual, technical, intellectual assets, does everything it can to survive. Then it comes before the last temptation to believe that bare survival is preferable to survival in justice. This is the lasting temptation awaiting a people in their desert days, the biggest, almost mystical crisis before which a people can stand. I believe that in a strange way, this is the crisis from which a people appear, reborn, young, creative, the dark night of the soul, in which he says, that is NP van Wyk Law, I would rather perish than survive through injustice." This has been Right and Recourse. This program is repeated at 5 on Monday morning. From all of us here in the studio, thank you to our guests and good afternoon.
I'm Alicia Jali, joining us live from our Johannesburg studios. A quick look now at your current news leaders. Parliament's Communications Committee has decided on 5 names to